Here's everything you need to know about vibe coding. All right, first, which tool are you going to use? There are a few different variations of what you can do here. First, I use Windsurf and Cursor most of all. I'm usually using Windsurf as of late. Windsurf is a code editor. It is also a fork of VS Code, the most popular coding editor on the planet. So if you're already using VS Code, this is a natural extension of what you're already doing. Now, another option is to use an extension in VS Code itself. So if you don't want a new IDE completely, you just want to continue using VS Code, you can use something called Cline. I've heard really good things about it. I've tested it a little bit, but not extensively. Another option is to use Replit. Replit is a completely online code editor. The cool thing about Replit is you can also deploy your apps really easily since everything is in the cloud anyways. Now, last and probably the easiest way to just get started is to use the Canvas feature in your favorite hosted AI. So here's Claude. You can just type anything you want. So here's an example, write Three.js code for the coolest spinning 3D shape you can make. Now, once you're done, you can open it up in the Canvas and you can run it right from your browser. So here's just an example of something that I coded up over about 20 minutes. Now, there are limitations with this. You can really only run HTML and JavaScript. But since JavaScript is the most popular coding language on the planet, you can actually accomplish quite a bit running it directly in the browser. And not only that, ChatGPT has a Canvas feature and Google just released their own Canvas feature. So more and more you're able to write and execute code without ever leaving your browser. But for more complex projects, I'm still going to one of these other tools that I mentioned. Also, those other tools are agents. When you type in a prompt into Claude or ChatGPT or Google for it to write code and then execute that code, it's not actually going to be iterating on the code. It's just not as agentic as a Windsurf or a Cursor is. And speaking of Windsurf, thank you to Windsurf for sponsoring this video. I also just happen to love using Windsurf. Windsurf is fantastic. I use it for vibe coding all the time. You can easily switch between chat, write, and legacy modes. They have a bunch of different model options. So Claude 3.7 thinking, Claude 3.7, Claude 3.5, OpenAI models. And so you can use the right model for the right task. They also just released a ton of new functionality around tab completion, such as tab to jump, tab to import, and the tab functionality, tab completion, has context of not only your code base, not only what's in your terminal, but what you're writing in Cascade as well. They also just released browser preview functionality, which is really nice. Automatically, Cascade will offer a browser window so you can look at the project that you're building as you're building it, and you can give it specific feedback by clicking on areas that you say, this is not right, or this is right, but I want to add this other feature. Plus, you can paste in URLs to library documentation, API documentation, anything you need to just give it that extra knowledge of how to write code in the way you want it to. So thank you to Windsurf for sponsoring this video. Go to wind.surf/Matthew Berman, download Windsurf right now, and get started vibe coding or traditional programming right away. All right, so next, you've decided to vibe code. Which coding language do you actually choose? And not only the coding language, but which code stack, because there are going to be multiple parts of your project. There's the front end and the back end, for example. And so how do you actually choose which coding language, especially if you don't have any experience with any of them? Well, I'll tell you, there's one simple rule. You want to choose the most popular coding language because that means there's a lot more code examples for AI to have been trained on, which means it's probably a lot more experienced and can write better code. The most popular coding language in the world is JavaScript. So if you're vibe coding and you want to write it in JavaScript, that's a great option. Another option, and really the de facto coding language of artificial intelligence, is Python. And I really like Python. And so the code stack that I usually go for is Python for the back end and HTML and JavaScript for the front end. But you don't have to use Python for the back end. You can use JavaScript for also the back end using something like Node.js. But the point is, choose something that's popular. And I found this really cool graphic called GitHut 2.0, and it basically shows you what all the most popular coding languages are. So you can see right here, Python, Java, Go, JavaScript, C++, TypeScript, and so on. And I'll drop this link in the description below. All right, so you've chosen the tool you're going to be using, let's say Windsurf. You chose your code stack. You're going to be using Python for the back end, JavaScript and HTML for the front end. Now what? Now you want to come up with a plan. You really want to spend a lot of time on this step. You want a detailed, thorough plan that you can pass to AI so it knows exactly what you want to build. You want to try to think about all of the edge cases and write it down so that the app behaves exactly how you expect it to. But you don't need to write all of this yourself. You can use AI to help you. Now for this, I'm usually going to Grok for help. And so here's an example. Write a detailed plan spec for a SaaS app I want to build where I can drop links to articles, YouTube videos, research papers. Then it uses AI to summarize each of them and can use relevance search to help me search through all of the stored articles. And then I'll finally add, ask me questions to help fill out any gaps in what this app should be. So Grok can actually help you figure out all of the different features and functionality that you want to add in here. And you don't need to just take the first thing that it says. You can work back and forth with it until you come up with a really nice plan. So here you can see a bunch of questions that it asked me, and we can answer them to the best of our ability. Obviously, some of them are going to be a little bit more technical, and if you don't have that technical ability, again, just work with Grok and have it explain to you what each of the concepts mean. Then at the very end, I'm going to say, write this in the format of a PRD, which is a product requirements document, and we're going to use .md markdown file format. And so here we go. And so once it writes it all, we're going to copy it and put it directly in the directory that we're building our project in. And we're going to store it for later, and I'm going to explain how to use it later. And then finally, I'm going to ask it to come up with a step-by-step to-do list to build this out in .md format once again, because .md just works really well with artificial intelligence. All right, so we can see here our checklist, our to-do list of setting up step-by-step what we need to get this app running. Now, it has ETAs on it, which obviously we don't need. So again, just work with Grok, tell it what you need, and get to a place where you have your overall plan and then your to-do list. Now, I can't stress enough how important it is to spend time and invest time at this stage. You really want to think through every possible feature you might want, every edge case, every permutation that you can possibly think of. This is really what traditional coding is all about. Those edge cases, those details are where you're going to have problems in the future. If you don't think of them now, they will come up in the future, and making changes in the future is always going to be more difficult than thinking about it and implementing it right from the get-go. Now, the good thing about having the plan, the good thing about having the to-do list is you can always have AI go back and reference it so that it stays on track more effectively. And as you're vibe coding, as you're progressing in your project, you can always go back and update your plan. If you realize you don't need a feature, or you realize you want to add a different feature, or you want something to behave differently, go back, make the changes in the document, make the changes in the plan. All right, next, let's talk about version control. This is the thing that is going to save you a lot of headache and your sanity in the future. Now, if you're not familiar with coding at all, version control is exactly what it sounds like. It allows you to essentially save your code at different points as you're building. Now, why is that important? It's not just important for vibe coding. It is crucial, absolutely critical for any coding, traditional coding, vibe coding, whatever it is. You need a way to store your code and to save it at certain points in its life. That's because if anything goes wrong, you can always roll back. You can find a previous point at which you know the code worked how you expected and just revert the code back to that point and start again. This is especially important for vibe coding because AI does tend to sometimes make huge changes across your code base and just completely break the code. And so if that happens, rather than going into these really long loops of no, fix it, and no, that didn't work, fix it again, try something new, fix it again, you simply throw out the recent changes and start from your most recent stable code. So if you've never coded in your life, then you may or may not have heard of something called Git, G-I-T. That is the default version control software that essentially everybody uses. It allows you to save your code at different points and do a lot of other really cool things. And it's also really valuable for when your code base becomes really large and you want to work on different features or different pieces of functionality at the same time and then put it all together at the end. But Git can also be pretty complicated. The good thing is you can actually have your AI coding assistant or your agent help you write the Git code, so you don't necessarily need to fully understand what it's doing. And I know a lot of you programmers out there are probably cringing at that statement. And let me actually just pause for a second. It is really good to learn all these traditional coding techniques, but if you don't want to, you don't have to. If you're just trying to build a game for yourself and you're not going to put it out and let the world see it, it's okay. Just do your best. Get something up and running and have fun. I would recommend to just learn the basic terminology of Git, like commit, revert, logs, stuff like that. But after that, you really don't need to know the more complex stuff. And so the first thing you want to do before coding anything is get Git installed. And I have an existing project that I was just playing around with quickly. I didn't install Git. Let me show you how to do it. And it really should just be as easy as telling your AI agent to do it. So I'm simply going to say install Git. And it does say right here, Git is typically pre-installed on Mac OS, but let me check if it's installed. So it's really just going to handle everything for you. Git is the command, git -- version just makes sure that it's installed properly. So it says it's already installed. Then I just say add Git to this project. So it's running the command git init, which is initialize, and it is creating the git ignore file, which means the files you don't want to include in the Git. Spinning up a new branch. Again, you'll learn all of this lingo as you go, and if you have any questions, just simply ask your AI. And it's already making its initial commit. So that's your first save point. And that's it. It's as simple as just talking to your AI and getting it to do it for you. Now, if you're using Git, everything is going to be stored on your computer, your local machine. But you really want more secure code storage than that. And so I use GitHub. That just means taking your Git, taking your code and pushing it to the cloud, and you're storing it there. It's kind of like Google Docs for code. And it's free. Sign up for GitHub and you can ask AI to help you set it up. All right, so next let me talk about rules. Most of these vibe coding tools, Cursor, Windsurf, Client, they support something called rules. Rules allow you to have your AI coding agent write code in the way that you want, following the structure that you want, and following the workflow that you want. It's kind of like writing a system prompt for your LLM. It's something that's going to be included in every single prompt that goes off to AI. So it really is like a system prompt. Now, depending on which tool you're using, your rules are going to show up in different places. Let me show you Windsurf. So down here in the bottom right, you're going to look for this Windsurf settings. You're going to click it, and right here it says memories and rules. You click manage. Also, this is where memories can be found. So with Cascade, at least, as it's developing a project, it's going to be storing memories about your project. And if you find that the memory is not right, you could just delete it and start over. Down at the bottom here, you're going to see user-defined rules. You have global rules and workspace rules. Now, global rules means rules that apply to every project, and workspace rules are rules that only apply to a specific project. So let me show you some of my global rules. So of course, it's in a markdown file. It's very simple to edit. It's all natural language. So here's the first one. After making changes, always make sure to start up a new server so I can test it. What I found is it would make changes and then I would have to manually either kill the existing server and spin up a new one or just spin up the new one. And so I wanted it to just do it for me every single time. So anytime it makes a change, it spins up a new server for me and pops open the window on my behalf. Another problem that I ran into is I would tell it to make an update, and rather than looking for existing code to evolve or iterate on, it would just write completely new code to satisfy my request. And so I always want it to first look at the existing code and see if you can change that before writing new code. And I ran into this issue a lot. And so I really put a few of these rules together to make sure that it looked and it tried to use existing patterns before inventing new ones. So do not drastically change the patterns before trying to iterate on existing patterns. I also have things like always prefer simple solutions, avoid duplication of code. Obviously, it should do this by default, but I've found putting more emphasis on it through rules just makes it write better code. Here is a really important one for me. Write code that takes into account the different environments, dev, test, and prod. And so just a very quick rundown of what it means. But of course, if you want to go into more detail, ask Grok, ask Claude, they'll explain it. The dev environment means the environment that you're coding in. So when you open up localhost and you see your code running, that's your dev environment. Your test environment is the environment that you're tests used, and we haven't covered tests yet. I'll get to that in a few moments. And then your prod or production environment is what you're going to be deploying and the world is going to see. And so you treat all three of these separately. And again, if you're not familiar with coding, it might not make sense why you would need these three environments, but I encourage you to get an understanding of it. Ask AI to explain what instances you might need different environments for. Then I have some rules that I put in place after vibe coding a lot and just noticing the tendencies of specifically Claude 3.7 thinking, where it would do things and I was like, nah, I don't like how you're doing that. Make sure don't do that in the future. And I would notice it, write it down as a rule, and then it wouldn't do it again. So here's one. Avoid writing scripts in files if possible, especially if the script is likely only to be run once. So if I needed something changed and the AI wrote a script for it, it would write it to a file and the file would be there permanently. And I would just find all of these scripts that I never used more than once. So I didn't want it to do that. Just run the script yourself in console or delete the file after you're done with it. Now, here's a really important one. You want to keep your files really short. Now, I said 200 to 300 lines of code. You could even do 100 lines of code. It just keeps the code more modular. It also allows AI to write and iterate on the code more quickly. Now, some of you in my last vibe coding tutorial video asked for this file, so I'm going to put it in a gist and drop it down below in the description. So these are all workflow rules. These are all general rules that I always want my AI coding assistant to follow. But there are some rules and best practices that are specific to a coding language. And let me show you where to find those. I found this awesome repository on GitHub, and it's called Awesome Cursor Rules. It applies to not just Cursor, but also Windsurf. And they're just markdown files that are specific to coding languages and really just lay out best practices dependent on your environment or your coding language. So if you scroll down a little bit, here are front-end frameworks and libraries. So let's say you decide to use React, which is a JavaScript front-end library. Click into it, and here are a bunch of rules for it to follow. So these are just best practices specific to a coding language. If we go back, we can find backend and full stack. So here's Python with fast API, bunch of great rules. Use functional components, use declarative route definitions. If you've never coded before, you might not know what any of this means, but you can use it. These are pre-reviewed, and if they're included in these awesome cursor rules, they're generally pretty good. All right, so now let's talk about the overall workflow of vibe coding. So remember, the first thing you're gonna do is save your project plan and your to-do list. So I took the project plan from Grok. I came over here and I'm gonna say, create a file called prd.md and put this in it. And I simply just pasted it in. Now, obviously you can do this manually as well, but I'm taking the vibe coding approach of really not writing any code myself. And there it is, prd.md, nice and formatted as well. So now we have our project plan. The next thing we're gonna do is create the to-do.md file. So back to Grok, I'm gonna highlight all of this. I don't need the post-launch stuff because again, we're just vibe coding, so I'm not thinking about getting user feedback and all that stuff. And so I say now create a to-do.md with this and pasted it in, hit enter, and it's going to create that file as well. And here it is. Here's the to-do file, so we can accept the code. Now we have our project plan and our to-do list. Now, the overall workflow that you're going to be following is as follows. So you're going to have your AI assistant read your project plan, read the to-do list, and develop one thing at a time. I can't stress that enough. One feature at a time. Now, initially, when you're just starting your project, it might have to build out kind of the framework to do a lot of this. And so it's going to be more than one. But after that, when you're adding things to it, one thing at a time. Next, once you add a feature, you're going to add tests. If you've never coded before in your life, just think of tests as separate code that makes sure your actual code is working as expected. Now, this is super important to write tests along the way and at every single step, because once you have code that works as you expect it, you will make sure it works with those tests. And in the future, as you make changes, if any of those tests break, it tells you that the functionality you had previously is no longer working as expected. And at that point, you can either change the test to update based on the changed functionality, or you go back and you fix what may have been broken. Once your new tests have been written, you're going to run those tests. Those tests literally test the code to make sure it works the way you think it should work. Once those new tests have run and passed, then you're going to run your entire test suite and make sure all of your code works exactly as you expect it to. Now, if any of your tests fail, you need to fix it. And there's really two ways to think about fixing tests. One, you fix the actual code and make sure that eventually those tests pass. So something broke with your code, you fix it, and then the test will eventually pass. The other thing is if you updated the functionality and the new functionality make the test fail, but it is how you want it to work, you need to update the tests themselves. Both of these things can be done by your AI coding assistant. All right, so here's a fun little simulation I was playing around with yesterday. Let me show you what writing tests looks like. So I simply say, write tests to make sure this app works as expected. All right, so we can see Windsurf has written a bunch of tests for us. If we look on our left side over here in the tests, we can see all the tests that have been written. So all the tests are done. Let's run them. Run the tests. So after all the tests ran, we can see that there are 11 failed tests. And since this is our first time writing tests, you can say fix the test. Once you get going, you may want to take the extra step of saying explain why the test failed and decide if you want to fix the test or fix the actual code that broke the tests. But that's the general flow. And then once you get all your tests passing, you commit, and that's the git command. So you just say commit the code. And so it's gonna go through the entire process of finding all the files that changed, committing them, writing a commit message, and then if you have GitHub, push it off to GitHub. So let's go through the overall flow one more time. Reference the plan, check your to-do list, and build the next feature. Then write tests for the new feature. Then run the tests for that feature. If everything passes, great. Move on to the next step. If it doesn't pass, fix the test. Then run the test for the entire code base. If all the tests pass, great, move on to the next step. If not, fix the test that failed. Then save your code by committing it to Git. Then rinse and repeat. Do that over and over again. That is the overall flow. But sometimes your code gets to a place that is just unfixable. AI sometimes does this. It just wrecks your code and there's not much you could do. So what you're going to want to do is roll back to a previous commit. And that just means any of the new changes that you just made will be wiped away. You can store them if you want. It's called stash, git stash, and you could use that as well. And again, all of this stuff you don't actually need to know the git commands for. You just tell your AI to do it. But otherwise, you say roll back to the previous commit, and that'll get rid of all of your recent code and go back to the stable place that you know worked. All right, now I want to tell you just a few miscellaneous things that'll just make your coding experience better and also give you more options. So first, I want to talk about chat versus write mode. So write means it will write code, and you could ask it not to, but if you're in write mode, you mostly want it to write code for you. Now, if you switch over to chat mode, that is just asking questions. That is essentially the same thing as having a direct chat with the large language model, except also you give it the context of your code base. You can also select all the different models that you want to use right here. Now, what I've found is that Claude is the best coder. A lot of people are saying Claude 3.5 is still the best, but I really like Claude 3.7 thinking. Now, one thing that I've noticed lately is that AI is not really able to code beautiful front ends. It can code really basic stuff, and that's great. But if you want something really beautiful, the best way to do that is to actually find a free template online. So with all of the designs already built for you, and then just download that, put it in your folder, tell AI about it and say, okay, now I want to build this, use all the components that can be found in this library. So simply search for free Bootstrap themes or anything like that, and you can find this. So all of these little components, the graph, the charts, the fonts, everything is predefined. You can buy it here. You can find a lot of free ones as well. Another tip is to give your agent specific parts of the code that you want to update or fix. Now, obviously, you need to have a decent understanding of your code base to be able to do this, but you do that by just typing @ and you can add files, directories, docs, context, and web links. So don't forget you can do that. Now, I've seen a lot of people vibe coding games, and they're mostly using this library called Three.js. It's a 3D JavaScript library. Most AI already knows how to use it, and it's kind of having its moment right now. So it's a really cool library. Definitely check it out. And to reference it, you can simply do build me a game X, and X is describe the game, using Three.js, and it will use that library. Now, let's talk about security and maintainability. I've seen a lot of people, traditional programmers, speaking really negatively about vibe coders because they're saying, and probably valid, this code is not going to be maintainable and the code is really insecure, meaning once you put it up, you're going to get hacked, you're going to have your password stolen, you're going to be DDoSed, because you just don't know, as somebody who may not have ever coded in their life, what some of these best practices are. Now, there's a few things to do here to help yourself. One, definitely spend some time learning what some of the best practices are. But this is also a good time to use rules. You add rules, never do this, always do that, and these are best practices. But how do you know what these best practices are? Well, you can ask AI to write it for you. But this person, Jack Fricks, also put together a few really useful tips, and you can find more online as well. So for example, rate limit all API endpoints, use row level security always, CAPTCHA on all authentication routes and signup pages, and so on. And so there are a lot more than just these few, but you can discover them. You can search the web for them. You can ask Perplexity, you can ask Claude, and just get a list of these best practices and make sure you're using them, and then also add them as rules. Let's talk about maintainability. Yes, AI code is not always pretty, but just keep in mind, this is the worst it's ever gonna be. It's only gonna get better. And as you're building out a code base, if you're vibe coding it and you really don't know how to code yourself, it might end up being a pretty brittle code base. But you know what? That's okay. That's part of the learning process. And you can actually ask AI to refactor your code. And refactor just means make it more concise, make it more modular, don't use code duplication and other best practices. And again, all of these things add into the rules file that you have. And you can also ask AI to do a security audit for you. Simply look at all my code and tell me where I'm vulnerable from a security perspective. Here are some other best practices for security. So this is by Ted Werbel. Don't share a photo like the one below. So anytime you have API keys, these are the keys right here, do not share them publicly. I can't stress that enough. These keys, even in an image, can be taken and they will use your credits on whatever API you're using. You also never want to save your keys in Git. That's what the git ignore file is. Now, if all of this sounds like gibberish to you, don't worry, just ask AI to explain it to you. He also recommends using npm run audit if you're using a Node app. He also recommends don't roll your own authentication, which is a great piece of advice for almost everything. Don't roll your own anything unless you really have to. And roll your own means build your own. So use something like Clerk. Set up IP plus user-based rate limiting, DDoS protection, firewalls monitoring, and analytics. And again, use AI to learn all of this. And here's the thing about vibe coding. You don't necessarily need to learn all of it, but it's nice. I find all of this stuff so interesting. I have loved to code since I was a teenager. So hopefully with vibe coding, you get exposed to it and you learn to love it as well. And always write test automation for parts of your code base where the cost of failure is high, like payments, subscription management, usage tracking, etc. So great tips by Ted. Thank you. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is MCP servers. And if you're not familiar with MCP, it is a way to give your agents tools, additional tools. And you can configure the MCP server right here in Windsurf. You click it and you can actually ask AI to help you write this up, but you can have really cool tools added to your AI agent. And let me show you a couple of cool examples. So this is from Billowall. This is Unity MCP here. So it's a tool that can essentially connect right into Unity. Let's watch. So now it has direct access to Unity and you're essentially vibe coding into Unity. It's pretty awesome. So you don't actually need to know how to use Unity. And again, if you really like Unity and you really like creating these 3D models, then start to learn it as you're vibe coding. Here's another one using the Firecrawl MCP tool. Check this out. So it's doing deep research, Firecrawl deep research. So now all of a sudden your AI agent within Windsurf, within Cursor can go out, use this Firecrawl tool and get a bunch of information. So there you go. So definitely experiment with MCP tools. It's more of an advanced feature once you get really familiar with vibe coding, but I do recommend it. So that's it. Hopefully you learned a lot about vibe coding. I encourage you to do some vibe coding. If you're an experienced programmer, it's just fun and relaxing. If you're just learning, it's a great way to get exposure to all of this stuff and start your learning journey. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.